If I could start by asking you to perhaps briefly outline from each of your perspectives your thoughts on the childcare announcements in the spring budget, then we can move on from there. If I start perhaps with Brigitte.
Yes, thanks very much. Focusing first on the labour supply side of things, I think we would say that based on our research, we can expect the announcement of the spring budget to move more people into work. But mostly we would say this would happen once it is fully implemented. We have previous research on the free entitlement of 3 to 4-year-olds and found that 15 hours of childcare provision was not enough to move women into work, whereas when children then move into primary school, which is like full-time care, we did find a significant effect both on labour force participation and on employment. So for that reason, we would expect these effects to kick in once it's fully implemented in September 2025. At the time of our research, we did speculate that the 3 to 4-year-old entitlement was kicking in a bit too late for women. They might possibly have already disengaged from the labour market. So this announcement now is obviously an earlier supply which fits more seamlessly with maternity leave, and therefore we could hope to see some bigger effects. And it's also, I think, a benefit that we have a more unified approach now across the ages of children, which might be beneficial. And I think there's some, staying with the benefits right now, there's some other side effects that we should note, one of which is that if these measures are good for child development, then obviously we're enhancing the productivity of the next generation. And recent research that we've carried out also shows that childcare is very good for the mental health of mothers. And that's an aspect often overlooked and in turn can lead to a higher labour supply as well. Now, maybe looking a little bit more at the risks in terms of the labour supply, I think it's been noted before in this committee that we have to be clear this subsidy is only for 38 weeks, so in term time. I know it can be used across all the weeks of the year, but that reduces the offer to, in fact, I think 22 hours per month, per week, excuse me. Also, I think there is a bit of a decision to be made whether it should be offered for training and education, and potentially also for looking to work. So this is a small, these are, I think, things that could be looked at. But another bigger point to stress is that the labour supply effect, given the amount of subsidy that we're offering, is quite modest. The scale of the subsidy is large and the labour supply effect to be expected is small. And the reason for this is that we're crowding out a lot of private investment into childcare that is already happening, and we're also crowding out a lot of informal childcare that is already happening. This is what we've seen for our analysis of the 3 to 4-year-olds, and at the time we looked at the family resources survey and found that the 1-year-olds, which would be kind of the group that we're looking at here, 62% of them are already in some form of childcare, be it formal or informal. In fact, I mean, the end result of offering these subsidies, not a lot of children will be moving into childcare who have not otherwise been in childcare already, and hence the quite modest effects on labour supply. And connected with this, if I may go on, we know from the extension entitlements for 3 to 4-year-olds that it's more affluent parents who benefit from this. And so against this background, I think it is a question that should be raised, whether it's fair to offer like a flat rate subsidy to all families, or whether we should have a tapering off at the higher income points of the income distribution.
We will come back to later in the session.
So I think that is something that would give us more scope perhaps to target families further down the income distribution, and also the children, which brings me on to the childcare side of it. And I don't want to talk too long here, but I suppose what we know about child development is that it's beneficial for children if the childcare offered in a setting is better than what they would otherwise experience, the so-called counterfactual, which could be at home or in the informal arrangements or whatever settings children are in. And so the quality is what will be the decisive factor. And I'm sure that you're going to ask, or we will talk about in more detail about all these aspects of quality and how the funding is related to that. And also the types of children that we will be getting into childcare through an offer which is for working families, because we do know that the most disadvantaged children are in families that are not necessarily working families. But I don't want to take too much
Thank you.
time.
Thank you. I'll go over to Professor Lloyd.
Thank you. Well, to start, I think the proposals in the budget are the most exciting ones we've had since 1998, when the National Childcare Strategy was announced. But as far as the implementation of these proposals are concerned, like Birgitta, I foresee many problems because of the system we have, and very particularly because they are focused on relieving parental childcare costs. There are many other ways that other systems do address that issue, and indeed it is extremely urgent. But unless we address this issue at the same time as the completely unacceptable conditions of the childcare workforce, I very much doubt that we are going to get to a successful implementation. We have a situation where now parents are reducing the number of hours that they pay for with or without the help of the tax-free childcare or on the universal credit. And of course, they will still take the funded hours. So our providers are currently struggling with a reduction in income because of this. This is really happening, and it's happening fast. And then they're also struggling with the workforce absolutely having reached the end of the road, exhausted after COVID, now dealing with the cost of living crisis. They are leaving in droves. We've seen an enormous reduction in the number of well-qualified at level 3 people still, working here, and similarly with graduates, and it can only get worse.
And what do you think? I mean, what do you think are the solutions to that? Obviously, investing in the workforce, but how mechanistically should the budget or the government be supporting that?
I am not here to offer you some cost-neutral suggestions, but I'm sure I don't need to remind you of the work done by my colleagues here and others about the payback to the exchequer and the payback to communities and societies of investing more money. And I hope to talk later, if I may, about my experience working with the Irish government on a new funding model for their early years system. But core funding, another form of supply-side funding, is key. We cannot expect to pay decent wages and improve the working conditions of the childcare workforce through these per capita rates that are being paid. Per capita won't do it. And as Birgitta has already said, there are doubts about the amount of money that will come towards the 3 and 4 year olds. And, although for under 2 and 2 year olds it looks better, but, there will...
This is the £5.50, £8, £11.
Yeah, the proposals that
rates
are around, but really we cannot expect providers without increased core funding, which is certainly what happened in Ireland, and without quite serious public management, because the work of the International Centre for the Study of the Mixed Economy of Childcare that Professor Helen Penn and I established in 2007, and we are pleased she's sitting here behind me, but that work was really looking at the system of marketised childcare and the dynamics of marketised childcare, and whether those systems deliver on the policy aims that governments have, and successive governments here have had the same policy aims: social mobility, family economic well-being, and social justice, including all children. And the current system doesn't deliver on those policy aims. So core funding, additional funding that's going into the system, even if nothing else happens, but the proposals that we've heard in the spring budget should be conditional. Without conditionality, money will not arrive where it is most needed. We see that across the world in marketized systems, but particularly there will be an influx of private for-profit providers, many with a background which has nothing to do with childcare and early education. And it always happens when substantial public money comes into a system. Now, it's understandable, but it's got to be managed.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and I'll come to Christine.
Thank you very much. I think the spring budget is very clearly a statement of intent. So we will see by 2027 that spending on the free entitlement has doubled over its current level, which in turn has doubled since 2010. This is essentially taking the close to final step in establishing a new branch of the welfare state. So compared to 25 years ago, the government has very clearly made a decision that it has a role to play and it needs to find resources to play that role in those first 5 years of life. So I think that statement of intent and the resources to back that up will be welcomed by many people in the sector and recognize the goals of the early years system, like Birgitta and Eva have set out in terms of child development, in terms of supporting parents to work. But most crucially, I think, in this budget, in terms of supporting younger families with younger children with the cost of childcare. We estimate that around 85% of the spending done through these new entitlements will be spent on childcare hours that families are already using and already paying for. So that is not a silly thing to want to do. It's not silly. We know that those families with the youngest children, by a very long margin, face the highest childcare costs and struggle the most with those costs. It's certainly not a foolish thing for the government to wish to relieve some of the pressures and tensions on those budgets. But it does mean that when we think of this or bill this as or discuss this as a labour supply policy, we also need to keep in mind that most of the spending we're doing is not directly related to labour supply per se. And I think that reflects another part of this new branch of the welfare state that we've come on, which has really been a journey from the early introduction as an early education policy, which is why this sits within the Department for Education and why this is of such great interest to this committee, that it was initially viewed as being about supporting children to become ready to start schooling and to access that early education that it was felt that they needed. We've moved quite a long way since then, and that's been a kind of gradual process with ever more emphasis on the labour supply aspect of this childcare offer. And I think what we saw in the budget was really quite a decisive step in that direction to say, really, the priority here and the focus here is labour supply and supporting parents to work and supporting families with childcare costs. I say that because of the targeting of these policies, which the committee has already heard about from Birgitta and Eva, in terms of support for working families. And I say that because of the rhetoric around this offer and the way that the Chancellor has kind of asked the sector to deliver these entitlements. What that's left us with is a system which is administered by the Department for Education, as Birgitta mentions, based on ideas about the school system, about term time, about 30 hours being a full-time place, but is being asked to do the job of supporting parents to work. And so that leaves us with, several real oddities in the system. Birgitta referenced whether these hours are going to be available for parents who are training or in education, or parents who are seeking to work. What we know about the current 30-hour entitlement is that there is a waiting period, essentially. Parents are advised to apply for their 30-hour codes 4 to 10 weeks before the start of the term in which they wish to take that offer up, which means they need to be working 4 to 10 weeks before the start of the term in which they wish to take that offer up. So I think there are questions here about the design of this and how that will support people into work. There are also fundamental questions at the top end of the spectrum with the decision to cap the entitlement and exclude families where one earner is earning more than £100,000 per year. Obviously, that's a lot of money. Obviously, those families are well off. But that blunt cliff edge that's built into the system creates some very odd incentives where a parent with 2 very young children in London would be better off refusing a pay rise of almost £40,000 almost £40,000 they would leave on the table rather than give up on the childcare support through these new entitlements, which strikes me as a slightly odd design feature to put into a policy that we think is supposed to be about promoting labour supply and supporting parents to work. But I think the first order consideration here is the deliverability of this policy. We estimate that even before anybody changes how much childcare they're using, the government will now be buying around 80% of the preschool childcare hours in England. When you're buying 80% of the market for anything, you really have to be sure you're getting the price right. Because if you set that price too low, providers may choose not to offer.
What's your point of comparison to that? Where would it be starting from?
So at the moment, it's about 50%.
Right. Okay.
So this is already the government has quite a heavy weight in that market, and that has caused some distortions, which I'm sure we'll discuss more. But this is really, we're reaching the point where all of the channels for cross-subsidizing and the channels for sort of working around Whitehall when it gets that rate wrong, those are by and large being shut off, which poses great risks. On the other hand, there are also risks of setting funding rates far too high, particularly in the context of a market which is a mixed economy, which is regulated, but where quality and prices are difficult for regulators to observe. So there is a risk here of inefficient public spending as well if we go too far in the other direction without commensurately increasing the quality of the care on offer. It is the rates that we have seen, at least for the 2-year-olds and the under 2s, do look sort of in line with or more generous than current market prices for childcare. So that is an encouraging sign. For 3 and 4-year-olds, the picture is a little bit less clear that those rates really will be adequate. But I think for me, the fundamental question here is setting these rates is really hard. Getting them right is really hard. We've seen that the process in the past has been driven quite a lot around spending reviews or set-piece announcements, or when does the sector get so much into crisis that we think it's going to fall over and maybe we should whack a little bit more money in. When you're buying 80% of the market, that sort of ad hoc way of setting your funding rates and determining them, that feels riskier than ever before. So getting the process right to set and to review the evidence and to revise these funding rates, I think that will be absolutely crucial.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point. And Eva, I just want to come back to you because you've advocated in written evidence wholesale reform of the childcare market. I mean, what would you see that as looking like? Where would that end up?
It would end up with a much more integrated system, because at the moment we are still dealing with that early education funding, and which we call childcare, but we still have the legacy of the model of the downward pressure of the nursery class model, nursery class in primary, maintain primary model. But in fact, to step away from this and look at it, actually free, the all or nothing approach, I think as Christina said in her submission, is not the norm across Europe. The norm is income-related fees for parents, capping parental fees, having a decision about how much it is reasonable to expect parents to pay from household income for the childcare and early education for their system. So Scotland has gone one further, and it said 30 hours for all children, also aiming to get in the children whose parents are not going to work, and aiming this as part of an anti-poverty strategy. And I think we should bear the anti-poverty aspect of these measures in mind all the time, given the present child poverty rates, which are appalling for this country. So it is a managed market with much more public input, much more public management, I see. And I think of the work by one of the economists whose work I really like, apart from the work of my colleagues, which is Mariana Mazzucato, who talks about, from a policy perspective, we need to shape the market rather than fix the market. But to do that, we first have to ask the question, what kind of market do we want? So the focus goes onto the partnership, the kind of partnership that the government has with the providers. Now, we have a complex mixed economy of childcare because we've got public providers, we've got private for-profit and not-for-profit. In Germany, they're largely not-for-profit, and if one is a for-profit provider, there is no public funding. So only about 3% of the providers in that market are for-profit. But we have that complex arrangement, and that needs looking at. So there are big changes. But again, the importance of the outcomes for children, the importance of the benefits for communities and societies, and for the exchequer in the end. There's interesting research. I mean, my colleague at the Open University, Jerome de Heenau, has done interesting research on creating a system where parents work fewer hours, but there is free childcare, and what the payback to the exchequer is from those models. Mm-hmm. The New Economics Foundation doesn't work on that. There is the childcare guarantee, which is being rolled out in the rest of Europe. IPPR has looked at that. There are all sorts of ways of taking the market, and of course some of us would say we've got to look at this excessive profit making that is going on within the childcare market. Most of the children receive their early education within this market. The proportion who receive their early education, I'm still using that term, in public provision is about a third. So we really are talking most children under 5. So it is very important to grapple with the role of profit extraction from this sector, the role of private equity and hedge funds. In our submission, Helen and I said, we are slightly encouraged by the Bank of England establishing or planning a stress test of the role of the largely unregulated second banking sector in this country, the role of private equity, because there is concern about the stability of the UK economy. Well, we've been concerned about the stability of the early childhood education and care system for over 20 years.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Miriam.
Thank you, Chair. So we've been talking about the impact of the budget announcement in terms of getting parents back into the workplace, and I think the government's own figures suggest that the policy, if implemented properly, which I know is up for debate, would result in 60,000 parents returning to the workforce. Now, my maths tells me that's about £5,300 per returning parent, and if that parent returned on a median wage, they might pay £3,500 back to Exchequer. So to my mind, in tax, that's not a particularly good outcome for the taxpayer. So what would be a better way, if your aim was to get as many parents back into the workforce as possible, what would be a better, more efficient way of doing that? Christine, do you want to give that?
Well, I think that's an important point, and I think when we think about the Exchequer impact of this policy, this is a big giveaway for the average full-time woman who is the average woman who is working full-time. This giveaway is worth more than getting rid of all of their income tax and all of their national insurance contributions, which is a way of suggesting that, at least in the sort of short term, it's unlikely to pay for itself. Yeah. I do think that that's not necessarily the only benefit that the government is hoping to realise from this reform. So we spoke earlier about the costs that families pay for very young children in childcare, and it's not that this money is sort of going away and disappearing out into the ether. It is relieving pressures on family budgets for families who are already working and are already paying for formal childcare. But I think there's also an important question here about what the aim is in terms of labour supply. We think that there are benefits for people going back into work and reasons, if we're trying to think about reasons why the government might wish to intervene to make that be so, chief amongst those might be things like the gender wage gap and promoting greater equality between men and women in the labour market, or things like the long-term impacts of taking a few years out of the labour market and what impact that has.
Sure. But those are ideological aims. So, for example, in countries that have higher female participation in the workplace, you tend to get a greater gender pay gap, because the more women that return back to work, the more formal jobs are created in childcare and elderly care. They tend to be low paid. So therefore, the average wage of a woman decreases in the gender pay gap. Now, it depends whether you think that matters. But the polling suggests that the vast majority of parents of under 3s would prefer to work less if they had a choice. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that for many families there is no financial choice, but why is it inherently a good thing to try to increase participation in the workplace for parents of under 3s?
So my next point actually was going to be exactly along those lines. What the OBR's estimates suggest is that most of the 60,000 women, or parents, but largely women, who will be entering work are likely to be working an average of 16 hours per week. What we know is that the benefits in terms of the gender wage gap, in terms of those long-term career pay and progression points, those are much, much less when people are working part-time roles. So I do think there is an important question about being clear that labour supply in and of itself is not always an aim, a goal, a necessary thing. Of course, parents' preferences do play a role, but equally, it would not be a silly thing for the government to say, you know, we have an interest beyond the exchequer cost in helping people to live full, complete, satisfied lives. And if what they choose to do, if what they wish to do is go out into paid work and use those skills and education they've built up, then we have an interest in supporting that.
Yes, that's really interesting. So what you're saying is actually the aim should be that to help women who want to keep their hand in a career, for example, to help people with cost of living if the childcare costs are too high, to kind of be a more flexible help to what people already need, but that may not have the big bang impact on hundreds of thousands of people returning to work. So, you know, and I think that's a very good model and aim, but what should the Chancellor do if he wants to get more parents back to work? What would be a better policy? I'll go to Eva, if that's okay.
Yes, I have to come back, I'm afraid, to my first point, that if we're really serious, there has to be much more rigorous reform, and we have to start with the childcare workforce now. In the Nordic countries, they started 50 years ago. You know, we have lost so many opportunities to look at all parts of the system, you know, that really without the people, we don't get the outcomes for the children, and we might not even get the enjoyable experiences. You know, it is so. But I also agree with what Christine has just been saying about what we see in systems that have good support for the early childhood education and care system is that by and large those governments also more generously support parents in their task of child rearing, because the importance to communities and societies and to the exchequer is so huge of what parents do.
Yes.
And it is being neglected. And the way, you know, a child-friendly community with more facilities, which means more money for community initiatives, but also local authorities who can play a role there. The local authority role in all this is absolutely crucial. And just as an aside, if you look at the Nordic countries like Norway, which has always had a mixed market economy of childcare, then you see, okay, 5.5 million inhabitants, 425 local authorities. They do a fair amount of micromanaging there, you know. So it is crucial. We know from the last ONS household satellite accounts I looked at, you know, calculated the price of parental and informal childcare, the contribution to the economy of that. It's huge. It's second only to transport, you know, in terms of... And of course, well, look at ourselves, you know. Well, in my case, it will be looking after grandchildren now, not children so much, but... you know, parents spend far more time looking after their children than the children will ever spend in formal provision.
Which brings me on to my next question, actually, which is one of our witnesses was Anne Fennell, who chairs Mothers at Home Matter, which is a group that support women who want to be able to stay at home while their children are young and choose to do that. And she pointed out that, you know, all this £3.2 billion is to help families on condition that both parents return to work for a set number of hours and you put your child in formal state-funded childcare. And what she was making that exact point, that the contribution that, well, of both parents obviously, but nor others make, not just to the current economy in terms of doing hours of labour, but in also the kind of foundations of attachment and emotional security that they lay in their children for later life, should also be recognised by the government, whether that's through the tax system, as it is in other countries, or in vouchers or other ways of doing that. Would you support some kind of system that was more flexible, that would support women in their choice and not just push them in one direction?
My ideal system would support parents, fathers and mothers in their choices.
Yeah.
Although I can see that, if only from a public health perspective, the first year is crucial, the support for mothers. And I think really would like to see the whole first year, devoted to well-paid leave that will encourage parents, take it in terms, to stay at home with an infant. So yes, I would want both. So the true choice can only be there and I also want to say that, of course, the very welcome increase in childcare support that will be available under the benefit system, universal credit, has got quite strong conditionality attached now to it. And that really worries me, because we have seen an explosion in the number of young families needing universal credit. And basically, our early childhood education and care system holds seriously below the waterline. So how can we impose conditionality then on mothers of 1-year-olds and so on if there is no well-functioning system for them to make use of?
Yeah.
This is crucial.
And we had the lady who chairs a gingerbread charity that supports single parents, and I think around 80% of single parent families are on universal credit, and now these often mothers are going to face this compulsion to return to work, even if their children have been through, emotional, trauma and things like that from family breakdown, and they feel that they now have no choice but to return to work and leave their child. So there's all sorts of problems around the conditionality,
which only a good system
yeah,
can cope with, and a compassionate society.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, finally, Birgitte, just to pick up on a point you made a point about, and if I heard this wrong, apologies, that, early years daycare essentially can have a positive impact in children's productivity later on in life. I'd be interested to hear more about that, because the research I've shown shows very much the opposite for most families, which is that a secure attachment with primary caregiver, so normally mum, in the first year of life, lays the foundation of resilience in times of stress that actually allows young people and young adults to cope much better with life, and that there's some links now between children who have been in daycare from an early age and who are less able, have more anxiety issues as teenagers and young adults. So I don't know, it's very different to the research I've seen, so I'd be interested to hear more.
I think in terms of the research, there is not a lot of research about very young children, because most countries offer childcare for 3 to 4 year olds or from 2 years onwards. So to find any good research for younger children is very difficult. Yeah. But the evidence that I have seen, and I have reviewed this literature recently, is that it crucially depends on the quality of the childcare. Yeah. So again, to what I said earlier, it always depends on what the counterfactual is. What are we comparing? Is it a secure home life? Is it a more chaotic home life? And what is the quality of the care that you're sending the child to? And in low quality settings, like there are examples in Canada where there was quite a cheap whole day care offered to very young children, the evidence shows that there are behavioral problems coming out of that more than, and social emotional well-being is affected, whereas academically you don't see that many differences. But this is an indication that it can be stressful, but it's related to many parameters again. Yes. It depends on how many hours do you send very young children into childcare, with long hours being perhaps more distressing for the child. So it's many dimensions that you have to compare.
Essentially, what you're saying is this quantum of funding, unless there is some significant change, is unlikely to be able to fund the kind of quality provision that would be an improvement for most children on.
Well, I mean, this leads us on to a whole different, quite complicated debate. So the one thing is, how do we define childcare quality? And this is difficult. I've done research on this as well. As you know, you can describe childcare along the lines of structural dimensions. How qualified are the childcare teachers? What are the child to adult ratios? And the literature does not often find a very strong relationship between those structural characteristics, because the actual quality, the experience of the child, what you would call process quality, is something different. It's the experience that you have, and it's not necessarily linked to the academic degree of the teacher that you're facing. So it's quite difficult to define quality. But let's say, these other more refined measures, including offset ratings, which we find to be quite successful in pointing out high quality childcare settings in our research. These more, difficult to collect measures, let's say we can use them to create high quality settings. But then I think the other important question is which children are you actually enticing to attend those those settings? And if you link free childcare to working, we know from the evidence that it's going to be more high income children and not the children who stand to benefit the most. Yeah. And in order to reach those children, and this is, you were talking about the aims of the policy before, and Christine has talked about the labour supply and also the helping children, parents with young children in their expenditures. But the third pillar obviously is the enhancing child development side, and it possibly you could extend this to include closing the gaps between children of different backgrounds. And that leads us on to the question of how do we reach those children who stand to benefit most. And
that's an entirely different aim to how do we fill the workforce with parents.
It's very
isn't it?
different.
Yeah.
But can I just add one point, and then I'll finish, which is creating this support for working families obviously directs it towards the higher ups. But even if it's universal, like the 15-hour entitlement, we have a proportion of parents who will not send their children. We know that take-up is incomplete, and also the current 2-year-old offer. And I think that's a whole different thing that should be looked at. How can we get those parents? Because it's almost like reverse selection on the potential gains. That's what the literature finds. The very hard to reach are the children who would benefit most from going into high-quality childcare. I think
and that 2-year-old offer has risen over time, hasn't it? But it's still about 76%, I think, currently take-up, isn't it?
Yes, in the 2-year-old offer, it's it's around 70, and although 93%-ish go take up the 3 to 4-year-old offer, there's still these 7% are an interesting group. I think, for example, children with English as an additional language. And in our research, we have shown that they can benefit most from, it's not just poor families, it's also language, early language acquisition. And so I think that's important to look at as well.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to hand over to Ian.
Right, well, good morning and apologies for being late. I'm very sorry. We've kind of skirted into this already, but I wonder if we can sort of flesh out about extending the universal 3 hours entitlement, and do you think it's the most effective use of government resources for childcare subsidies of this nature, and do you think there are any potential risks, and do the economic advantages outweigh the social disadvantages, or vice versa? Anyone? Carry on, please.
Lloyd, do you want to start on that one?
Right. I think you have missed some of the discussion, and yes, that's because we have discussed this to an extent, but it's very good to hear this emphasised again, because it's so important where the public money goes. So,
I mean, from my perspective, is there something more effective for this group of children we could be doing with the money? Well, is there an opportunity cost, as it were?
What does seem to be the case, when you look across Europe, is that if a system is easy to navigate, if it is generous, then it becomes attractive to parents. So in fact, you will see that the level of informal care goes down and parents are happy. This is definitely what happens in the Nordic countries, a generous system that is seen as high quality by parents, and that actually is staffed by well-qualified practitioners. But my concern, and concern of others, is that, is what the government is proposing to invest in this system, will it address those different sides of the coin?
I mean, I think you've raised an interesting question, because, you're saying the Nordic system is a generous system, but I think, it's been the way that it has been for quite some time, and therefore, for the vast majority of families, it is the norm, and therefore they don't regard it as generous, they just regard it as what they expect.
That's right, but it's the same in Germany, which is a much more recent change, and the change of every child from the age of 1 has a right to a place has been from 2013 onwards, and it's interesting to watch what happens there, you know, and that's a largely not-for-profit system. Because, of course, the context of every system is different. But I think my colleagues have just outlined, and Christine in particular, all the anomalies that still beset the current system, which are not going to be resolved by the proposals on the table.
It seems to me that the current system's a long way from a universal entitlement, isn't it?
That's right. It doesn't work like that. It allows increasing social segregation. You know, the children who only wanted, now we're going to change that in 2025, all being well, who only wanted the 15 hours. Well, frankly, they go to the bottom of the waiting list in many of the settings where parents sign them up, you know, put them on the waiting list, because for understandable reasons, but then we don't deliver on the policy aims for putting any public money in at all.
Given the current situation, I mean, settings will naturally and understandably, given the financial constraints, look for the most lucrative children from their perspective.
Absolutely, and of course settings have been cross-subsidising, and the social enterprise that where I am chair in Milton Keynes and in surrounding counties has that cross-subsidisation model, you know, where by having parents, well-to-do parents in Milton Keynes using additional non-funded hours, i.e. additional hours that if they're lucky they get tax-free childcare for, or, you know, we can cross-subsidise those children who only come for the 15 hours, or indeed some of them for the 20 hours, and that's is under threat with the current proposals.
Yes, I mean, because the point Christine was making really is that the current proposals, as they expand the government share of the market, they reduce the opportunities for that cross-subsidy.
Absolutely, and I think to your point as well, there is a huge opportunity cost here. There always is. It's a very complicated system. We currently have 8 different programs to subsidise childcare. We're now going to have 9 different programs to do that. We know that navigating that and making that understandable to parents is important, and we've seen that really quite vividly with the difficulties in take-up of tax-free childcare and universal credit subsidies. So I think you're not wrong to suggest that complexity and comprehensibility of the system is an important parameter to think about when we're designing this system. But I wanted to take this opportunity as well because you asked more broadly about the opportunity cost of this money. And I think it does come back to what it is we're hoping to achieve. I think the current sort of 30-hour thing that's the legacy of bolting on lots of different entitlements to something that started for early education, that's not going to be anyone's idea of the perfect answer to any of the questions that we want our childcare and early years system to achieve. Going more firmly down one of those routes gives us more opportunity to design something a bit more bespoke, but potentially at the cost of some of the other outcomes. I think what's most important here is that we're setting this in context of the wider early years system. When we're thinking in particular about child development, some of the programs that we've seen that have been most successful for children's outcomes in England have been things like Sure Start Children's Centres or the Family Nurse Partnership in the earliest years of life, programs that involve, home visiting, interacting with parents, and something that's very intense, not necessarily lasting for a very long time, and therefore not necessarily particularly designed around the idea of helping parents back into work. But that tool is still out there, and I think there's a risk that the budget proposals continue quite a long trend of the early years sector becoming ever more and ever more and ever more about the free entitlement, with much less focus on things like tax-free childcare or universal credit, which might be more effective tools to support labour supply if we got them working well. And with much less focus on some of those wider early years programs and integrated early years services that could deliver better outcomes for children.
I think one of the things that strikes me, though, and you've said, that there are 8 different systems now, soon to become 9. And that's different pots of money being spent in different ways. If we were to put all of that governmental money into one single pot and design one single system, might we get an overall better outcome? Or is the scattergun approach something that's better to be developed, or would be better starting with a blank sheet of paper?
I think there's always a temptation with policy design to say, let's start from a blank sheet of paper because it makes life easier. Yeah. We do have the system that we have in front of us. And I think one thing I would be very much in favor of is a wider ranging review to really agree what it is we want this system to deliver and use that to build towards a workforce plan, a market plan, a subsidy plan, how it is that we're going to get there. But I would also push back slightly on the idea that, you know, the answer is going to be that we agglomerate this pot of money and we do one thing with it. I think in practice, the aims of our early years sector are diverse. The policy goals we're trying to achieve are different. And so it makes sense that the tools to achieve those best will be different. The challenge is getting those tools to work together.
Well, I mean, yeah, but you wouldn't necessarily redesign a system which just does one thing. But what you could do is have a more comprehensive and interlinked set of policies which sort of dovetail more securely than the current system.
Absolutely. And I think the sort of current system really is a set of add-ons and bolt-ons and bits and pieces that have been glued together, which makes it much more complicated than it needs to be for parents.
Now, I apologise, you might have already fleshed this out, but I mean, the IFS noted that childcare support is now largely benefiting better off families. Mm-hmm. Is there anything more that you want to add to that in terms of you know, anything the government could do to mitigate any potential side effects?
So I think one piece of that is the design of the budget proposals themselves. We reckon that even before anybody starts taking up more childcare at the moment, the expansion will directly benefit just over half of parents with a child in that 9-month to 2-year age range. That's about 1 in 5 of families that are jointly earning less than £20,000 a year. It's about 4 in 5 of families that are jointly earning more than £45,000 per year. The fundamental question here is what it is that we're trying to do with this money. If the people we're trying to target are the people with the highest childcare costs, then yes, by and large, those are the families with larger earnings because, you know, being in London or the Southeast, parents working full-time professional jobs, using quite a lot of formal childcare, maybe they've moved away from their parents and so those informal options aren't there. Those people tend to have high earnings but also high costs. If what we're trying to do is really support child development and think about the most disadvantaged children at the bottom of the distribution, by construction, these budget proposals are really not about doing that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll go over to Kim. And if I can encourage the panel to give clippy answers so we can get to our next panel, that would be much appreciated.
No problem. And good morning, panel. I've got a question on the childcare provider market, and we know that the market has been under considerable pressure. COVID, cost of living, 170 childcare centres have closed with a loss of 10,000 childcare places. And Professor Lloyd, you mentioned about the private profit provision of childcare and the fact that so much profit has been extracted from the sector. So what extent do you think that the private provision has led to the inequality in the market between disadvantaged and more affluent areas?
Well, some of the large corporations haven't gone into the disadvantaged areas at all, but in the study that I did with colleagues at University College and Penn, and we did find a fairly even distribution of for-profit, but it's smaller for-profits in the disadvantaged areas, which of course have been acquired and merged with and so on at an alarming rate over the last few years indeed. And one of the results is that we've had no increase in childcare places since 2015. So while all these market dynamics are going on, we're not really making things more accessible or more affordable. Now, one of the interesting roles there that could be enhanced is the role of Ofsted, because whereas we've got extremely good statistics that the government can use to look at the early education, the funded hours, we've got very good statistics. Actually, our grip on what is really going on in on the childcare side, in the private profit market, is pretty light. So we need to know much more. But of course, Ofsted, who are inspecting all provision, do not collect a lot of the relevant information. They don't collect the information of whether a setting is freestanding, sole operator, whether it's a small chain, whether it belongs to a chain that runs 300 settings. It doesn't look at the salary structure. I mean, it looks at whether the EYFS ratios are met with the correctly qualified. But there are so many questions we all need, the government needs to know the answers to in order to be able to steer and shape that market.
Thank you, Professor Lloyd. Maybe my next question to Birgitta, and it's about educational outcomes. And I think, we've touched on the fact that the National Childcare Strategy in 1998 was very much focused on the eradication of childhood poverty. So in terms of this, the budget statement, and where we're up to at the moment, will more regulation in the childcare market help address the problems that we're now seeing?
You mean in terms of child outcomes?
Yes.
Whether it's more regulation is recommended? I think a problem that I alluded to before is that it's very hard to find easily measurable indicators that will tell you anything about the childcare quality, because teacher qualifications, child to staff ratios don't show such a clear relation to the outcome, and the more involved measures like the ECONOMISTS scales that are better measures of the actual experience of children in settings are very costly to collect, and although Ofsted has shortcomings and we would like more information about settings, in our research we find that their reports are related to child outcomes, with outstanding settings delivering better outcomes, in particular for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So I suppose regulating on the types of things that Ofsted measures would be a better way forward than just teacher qualifications and group sizes.
And I think you alluded to earlier on about how beneficial the likes of Sure Start were in terms of improving educational outcomes for children in disadvantaged areas. And I think that subject to wraparound care and the integration of all those agencies, do you think that the government needs to be looking more closely at how we look at replicating some of the positives of Sure Start going forward?
I mean, definitely, this is research that is in Christine's area more than mine, but one thing I would say is that Sure Start not only offers an integrated approach, but also these centres have been located in the areas where they are within pushing distance of quite disadvantaged families, and the focus on disadvantaged families, I'm sure, is what is part of the success, but Christine will know more.
I think that's right, and I think the integration point is very important. So we looked at first, at least, at the health outcomes of children, and it's very difficult to pin that directly back to a health service. It really seems to be something about the wide-ranging package of services and bringing all of that together, which is important.
Thank you, panel.
Thank you. You mentioned how difficult it is to quantify the quality of the provision. How much is that reflected in the qualifications of the early years practitioners and the teachers? Should they have, GCSE Maths and English, or should they have another sort of training? And actually, it'd be very interesting to find out how that relates to other countries as well, and the training they give at the early years and the nursery teachers.
Would you like me to start? Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I would like to start with a case study, and that's a case study about extreme deregulation, and that's the Netherlands between 2005 and 2012. I closely followed those, but really we did pass the Childcare Act in 2006, which was really the promotion of the childcare market, give freedom to the providers to give, in the Netherlands, all the supply side money was removed, and all the money was going to be demand side subsidies to parents to promote the market by, shopping around. The regulations were that group size was relaxed, ratios were relaxed. We don't actually have strict regulations on group size. We have them on ratios, but we follow generally considered good practice. But in the Netherlands, what the decision was then to keep the more highly qualified practitioners you know, because we all, you know, the thought was they would be good for the children. Well, the more highly qualified practitioners on their, you know, on their own couldn't really deliver the quality which was already going down. And the Netherlands were lucky in that they have had a very long longitudinal study that looks at quality in daycare settings, in group settings every 2 years. And the drop-off after this deregulation was dramatic between 2005. So there had to be a lot of rowing back on this. And what was once guidance was then changed into enforceable regulations in terms of what went on, rather than telling the market, deliver responsible childcare, which was the initial instruction. It was about, but you will also do this, and you will have, you know, obviously a mix of qualifications. So it can be, in fact, and it wasn't just self-interest that made the childcare sector in the Netherlands beg the government for a covenant of some kind to stop this deregulation. I don't quite agree with Birgitta about the results of the research. I mean, I think we have some interesting findings on the result. For instance, from the SEED study here, you know, we've got many good studies funded by the government on what makes a difference in terms of qualifications, which is a qualifications mix. And obviously, graduates do make a difference if they have sufficient practical experience, you know, and they really know about the challenges of working with young children for long days in daycare, but also the other different levels of qualifications are important. And it does worry me a good deal that we can work with 50% of our staff in the settings not having qualifications. I mean, this is very much unlike the rest of Europe by now.
Yeah, because it's not just about the academic qualification, it's also about pedagogy and child psychology and all that sort of...
All these things. There's so many demands on the worker, absolutely.
Okay, any other comments on whether they need GCSE maths and English?
I mean, I'm just interested in this point about sort of GCSE maths in particular.
Yeah.
A lot of settings have said to me, you know, we want people who are well qualified, who understand children, understand how to teach them, and so on and so forth. They recognise the importance of English skills because you need it for report writing and interaction. But there is a question about, you know, actually beyond teaching number. Do you really need GCSE maths in order to work in a childcare setting? And it seems a surprising requirement of being able to take the level 3 qualifications in some cases. View on that?
I thought actually that was one of the nastier comments in the otherwise excellent Brown report in 2012, that even for working in a veterinary practice you needed these qualifications, English and maths at GCSE, and you didn't in early childhood. And I was accused of not taking the quality of the setting seriously if I said I think we do need a gradual improvement, and that's why it's so important that we have proper continual professional development. It is just as important as initial training and qualifications, and because it would be unhelpful to have a total revolution, although sometimes I'd like to see it, you know, then these gradual but steady. And we have been on workforce strategies, on qualifications, we've been toing and froing and not really. You know, we had a very good period with the Graduate Leader Fund when it was ring-fenced, and we saw qualifications shooting up. And then when ring-fencing was removed in 2013, it really went down. What happened, you know?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to start with a general question, if I may, because we've just had the Easter recess. And this time of the year, as you're aware, politicians are always knocking on doors. And this came out just before Easter. And I've been very struck by the fact that this is being welcomed by parents on the doorstep. But I'm going around nurseries in my constituency of Southend West as part of this inquiry. But I'm not getting the same response from the nurseries that I am visiting. There's a lot of concern about the inability to cross-subsidise in the way they were doing previously, and real concern that big corporates nurseries are going to be the ones to survive, and that the smaller not-profit and that the smaller private nurseries, which are a converted house, which are providing, you know, fantastic care for young children, are not going to survive. And I was reminded of what happened, you know, by these nurseries that I've been visiting. I was reminded of what happened when the EYFS came in and was made statutory in 2008, and how that drove childminders out of the market, who didn't want to be part of such a heavily regulated sector. And of course, we've lost over 13,000 childminders in the 5 years from 2015 to 2020. So there are always unintended consequences of reforms. So do you recognise the concerns of the settings?
Absolutely, I do. And I think that goes back to some of the very earliest points that I made, because this is such an important point. When you are buying 80% of the market, getting that price right is vitally important. And so I think settings are, I can absolutely understand where settings are coming from, that given the way that the funding rate for existing entitlements has been developed, tinkered with, frozen in cash terms, eroded in real terms, all of a sudden, oh, maybe we should whack a couple $100 million in and boost that up a little bit. The sort of piecemeal ad hoc way that that's been managed, I completely understand why settings are perhaps somewhat disinclined to trust that the funding rates going forward will be carried out in a more sensible, evidence-based, consistent way that they're able to anticipate and act on and make sound business decisions. So I think one opportunity here is that the government has given itself a fair bit of lead time for implementing these reforms. I think that's quite welcome. That should allow for a lot of engagement with the sector. It's perhaps a bit of a shame some of that engagement didn't happen before the budget announcements were made, but that is perhaps inevitable. But making sure that engagement happens and making sure we get a proper process for setting the funding rate, I think, will be crucial.
That is another point that was made, that they weren't visited and asked their opinions previously. Thank you, that's very helpful. Professor Rab.
I don't think I have anything to add.
Thank you, that's a perfect answer as well. Professor Lloyd, thank you.
I think of Ireland, where there are a huge number of childminders who have not been regulated at all, basically not wanting to, you know, meet certain conditions. So only 75 childminders at the latest count were registered out of 15,000 or something. So it's quite a separate part of the system. Now, there is a childminding development plan to be carried out over 6 to 8 years to gradually bring childminders into the orbit of the whole system with the group, alongside the groups, you know. And I think that is very important, not to have these sharp demarcations, if only for safety reasons. I understand childminders' concern, because they, you know, they have been on their own implementing all this. But so there are models, you know, childminding networks. At one stage they were supposed to be everywhere, you know, and not just childminding agencies.
Yes.
I'm quite unsure about childminding agencies, or, you know.
Apologies, I was using that as an example of the unintended consequences, and the real concern is that big corporates will be the only ones to survive, and that we will lose a lot of the smaller nurseries and the not-for-profit nurseries that exist at the moment. That's the concern that was
right, yes, and I think people are absolutely right, and it will lead to ever greater segregation and ever more children losing out on having access to provision at all, because at the moment there is no plan to expand nursery provision in schools, but they could play a very important role, you know. Not, you know, the 30 hours is still largely delivered in the private sector. So the choices for children in low-income families, or families we have other issues than low income, but, you know, are very limited. It is an inequitable system, and the need to get hold of what is happening in the private for-profit large corporations, which are very insecure. The research that I referred to earlier, that with the team from University College and with Helen Penn and Professor Atul Shah from City University, really found that the fragility of the large corporations. You know, their lack of sustainability, they are indebted, they're in hoc to the...
Thank you. No, that's wonderful, but I must ask another question that we need to ask. This committee is visiting Finland next week, in fact, to learn more about their childcare system as part of this inquiry. So what do you think we can learn from international comparisons about the UK's relative high childcare costs, both from Finland but also from elsewhere?
So I think one of the things to learn from international comparisons is comes back to the aims of the system. What we've quite often seen is that in some contexts like Canada, which Birgitta alluded to earlier, we've seen systems that are very, very good at supporting mothers into work, but not so good and perhaps even slightly detrimental in terms of children's development. Scandinavian systems often lie at the other end of that spectrum. They're brilliant for children's development. They have long-lasting benefits that last all the way through middle age, but they did perhaps much less to support parents and mothers into work. So designing a system with that clear aim in mind and that clear goal in mind, I think, is very important. You also alluded, I think, to the costs, which I suspect was a coded reference to getting into ratios. I think that is one place where England is an outlier within Europe. We have some of the tightest ratios for particularly the under twos, but also for 2-year-olds even after the relaxation announced in the budget. There are vast difficulties in making those international comparisons because of the training of the workforce and all of those other issues we've been speaking about today. But that is one place where we stand out, and as Birgitta has mentioned, it's not always very clear from the international evidence base how much we can really say about how much those ratios are driving the actual process quality that children are experiencing in the settings. So I think that's still a place where the evidence is not yet quite conclusive.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
And I think another area to look at for international comparisons would be the way that childcare is funded. Eva has talked about the question whether we should have the same support for families regardless of their income. I think is a crucial decision to make. I think Miriam Cates also asked what is the best use of our money and where should we be putting it and which families should benefit the most. I think these are things that international comparisons can be very informative about.
Thank you.
May I come in on Finland? I had the pleasure of examining a PhD in Finland last summer, and this study was part of a concern amongst Finnish academics about whether the regulatory system they have in place will protect the universality of the service they want to offer to children and families, because Finland, like Sweden, has seen an enormous growth of the private for-profit providers. So the same what you hear on the doorstep, and this is introducing gently social segregation. So really the whole system is under review. It depends on who you talk to, but there are stresses in that system. With political change, there was a very sharp change to demand-side funding to promote the market in about 2016. That has been reversed under the government of Sanna Marin, who is no longer the Prime Minister in Finland, as you will have noticed. So there is some toing and froing between different approaches to what creates most provision and whether the Nordic model is actually under threat.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I was just going to go. You mentioned also your work with Ireland, and obviously you mentioned the childminder situation there. Anything else would be useful for us to know about the situation in Ireland? Because obviously it is another English-speaking system, and it's always interesting to look at what they do differently.
It is a very young system, so in many ways they didn't suffer from the past dependence that our system suffers from. You know, we go back to the 19th century with early education, and then it's much, much later the childcare support, public support. But Ireland, the funding model was doubling the funding for the whole system, doubling the funding in over a 10-year period. So that was the 2018 whole of government strategy, first 5, which was all the departments, all relevant departments, many together, producing, this strategy, wanting every child to be able to benefit from high-quality childcare. And the funding that brought out recommendations to the government on how to spend this double the money came up with, as the very first recommendation, in fact all 25 were accepted, now being implemented. This is an unusual policy advice experience, I have to say. And the first one was the workforce needs proper conditions, the workforce needs better pay, and therefore the government will pay core funding alongside a subsidy for early education and subsidies to the parents for childcare, and that core funding will have conditions attached. That core funding will have conditions attached about what their staff should be paid, because unlike here, there is no minimum pay. Staff were as low paid as here, and there was alongside this, there was a program by the Employment Department for actually setting a career structure in place, a legally enforceable structure, which is a major step. And the other important thing I think that Ireland did was have a workforce strategy development plan at the same time. So in parallel, and agreeing that doing things this way would require much more intensive public management. It would require a closer partnership between the government and the private sector, because Ireland doesn't have a public sector for early years provision, there isn't one. And therefore, this required a change of mindset. But the fact that 9 out of 10 providers signed up to this suggests that it was an acceptable compromise to lose some autonomy to actually getting extra money and enough to do more than raise the workforce pay and improve their conditions.
Thank you.
And parents,
Bring in Cathy, because her petitions committee, which she chairs, has been dealing with a number of...
you've raised a whole range of points there, and we just haven't got time in this session to do justice to the very rich evidence you've given this morning, so thank you. But I wanted to touch very briefly on 2 of the government's proposals that seek to address some of the workforce issues. So one being the promotion of increasing the number of childminders, and I know you sort of briefly touched on that, and sort of the incentivisation payments for people to sign up either as individual childminders or with childcare agencies, and to what extent you think that will solve some of the workforce issues. But then on the flip side, we have the ratio policy, which I think the government's intention is that it will reduce the cost of childcare and perhaps solve some of these workforce issues, but some of the evidence would suggest that it may have the opposite effect. So I'd be really interested to hear your views on to what extent those 2 proposals from the government are going to make the situation better or potentially worse.
So on the ratios point, I think this, as you say, was intended to ease life a little bit for childcare providers with 2-year-olds. The first thing to say is that many childcare providers looking after 2-year-olds already are not meeting those ratios, so the current ratios are not binding. That limits the scope for the regulation change to really affect them. I think that's about 20% of 2-year-old are in settings where those ratios are not currently binding. I think the motivation very much was around, we'll reduce the cost of provision and that will reduce the cost for parents. I think it is plausible that there will be some reduction, at least in the cost of provision there. If you look at the childcare providers who are bound by the current ratios, staffing makes up about 75% of childcare providers' costs. So if you do want to deliver a more efficient service, you do have to think about staffing, and given that you can't really adjust childcare providers' workers' wages down anymore because they're pretty much constrained by the minimum wage, ratios is really the only game in town if you're looking to reduce those staffing costs. But I think the really important point here is around deliverability. So the Early Years Alliance and others have suggested that many childcare providers just sort of don't want to touch this with a barge pole. They feel that their parents won't like it, won't want it, won't sign up. that will obviously limit the real world impact it has. And the other piece that will limit that is the market for childcare workers themselves. If you're making their job 25% harder than it is right now, and you're trying to do that without increasing their wages because you're trying to pass those cost savings on to parents, that strikes me as a pretty difficult sell at a time when the labor market in that workforce is already very tight and providers are already struggling so much.
I mean, do you want to comment on that? I would also ask and add to the question, because you say parents won't want that for their children, but there will be some parents that have no choice. And so will we end up with perhaps a lot of regional disparity in terms of quality of childcare as a result of some of the proposals, where those who can pay more end up with a higher quality and those can end up with a more compromised, it's certainly in terms of ratios, but also in terms of quality and quality of the workforce as well, potentially.
I think definitely we already have this situation where the families living in the more deprived areas have more rarely have access to settings rated outstanding by Ofsted. We already have that situation that the accessibility where you live is limited and the quality is quite different. So while we know that quite disadvantaged families can gain a lot by high quality childcare, they just don't have the access. And I think you're right that what we are going to see is a larger disparity in the offer through these kinds of steps, yes.
It is one of those areas where I think it really could have very bad outcomes for children with additional needs of any kind, because certainly after COVID, we have seen this really increased need for additional support for many children you wouldn't have expected. Now, if those additional support needs are not to remain transient, but then we do have to put more support in rather than less. As far as the workforce is concerned, it is just one other way of making them feel undervalued, because it is such hard work to really be there with you physically and emotionally and intellectually responding to children in a way that will promote their development, and so that what we're asking them to do, and then to say, well, actually, practical terms, of course, the way that groups are constituted varies too. I mean, how do you reduce the ratio for 2-year-olds who are in groups with smaller children as well, younger children, or with older children? There's terribly complex calculations which are in nobody's interest. By and large, that situation, I think, should be left as it is. Did you want to talk about childminders as well?
Yeah, I mean, do you think the childminder proposals and incentives will solve some of these challenges?
£600 is not a lot. If you're a new entrant to the childminding market, then you will need to probably make changes to your garden or to your kitchen, or and they will easily absorb the £600. I cannot foresee how the childminding agency's proposal would make an enormous difference to a lot of childminders immediately. It's an anomalous proposal, I think.
In terms of there's no evidence for it at the moment.
Yeah, of what is being done, what can be done. I mean, there'll be some agencies that will show that they can support childminders very well. Of course, in the past, it's been seen in the context of where you don't have to be inspected by Ofsted because you can be inspected. That was the original proposal in 2013. You can be inspected by the childminding agency, which is in turn, it's not very clear. About, and the scope of what's available is not sufficient at the moment.
Thank you very much. And we've overrun with this panel, but I think that's been because we've had some very rich and interesting answers, so I'm very grateful for that, and grateful for the patience of the second panel. If we can bring up the second panel at this stage, and thank you very much for all your evidence. Well, welcome, and thank you for sitting patiently through the first session. I think we will ambitiously aim to wrap up shortly after 12 o'clock, but may require some fairly snappy answers, and I hope the panel won't mind if we spill slightly over that time in order to get the most from this second panel, but I appreciate maybe members who have commitments elsewhere from that time. Delighted to welcome Ian Mansfield, Director of Research, Head of Education and Science at Policy Exchange, Adam Hawksby, Deputy Director of Onward, and Dr. Tammy Campbell, the Early Years Lead at the Education Policy Institute. Thank you all for coming to give evidence to us. And you've heard some of the views already expressed. If I can ask just to start perhaps with looking at the spring budget and what it did cover, but also any areas that you feel from your respective positions were missing from what could have been offered to support the sector and to support parents. Who would like to start? Tammy?
To start? Yeah.
Ladies first. Very good.
So yeah, sort of our view is that the current plans in the budget are a first step, and it needs to be checked, and it needs to be honed, and it needs to be improved on. We think that if this doesn't happen, as has been sort of touched upon in the previous session, the current plans risk skewing the balance away from good quality provision, particularly for disadvantaged children. The first thing that we need to happen that was touched on a little bit is that we think that the costings and the assumptions in the budget for both the additional payment for the current entitlement and for the new expanded 30 hours need to be made clear and justified. What we really don't want is a repeat of the previous expansion to 30 hours, which was underfunded, which we know actually from the Early Years Alliance's Freedom of Information was knowingly underfunded and which has had negative impacts on the sector. So we really think that the onus right now is on the department, on the government, to show the costings, to show the assumptions, and to show that this is going to be adequate for good quality, not just for some kind of sort of minimum floor standard. The other thing that we would like to recommend is that funding is weighted actually much more heavily towards children from low-income families and children with special educational needs, including disabilities. Because we know sort of from previous sessions of this committee that there are many disincentives to taking children who might need more support, and there are many gaps in access, as has been talked about at various points. And one way that we would like to recommend to do this is to increase the early years pupil premium so that it's in line with the pupil premium in the later school years. Because we have a bit of a strange situation at the moment where the early years pupil premium is just £342 a year. For primary school pupils, it's £1,455 a year. For secondary, £1,035. So actually, you kind of have almost this acknowledgement in the sort of compulsory school system that the younger children need more, but then for some reason that skews off in the early years. Another thing in that vein we'd like to happen is to do with the Disability Access Fund. So that is £800 a year, but it's only available for children who are in receipt of DLA. And getting DLA is extremely difficult. It's very difficult to apply for. It's very difficult to be awarded. And so we really recommend that the amount for disabled children is raised, and also that the eligibility criteria to identify which children would get more money under this criteria are revised. One last thing we'd like to note in terms of the budget, which was touched upon by colleagues in the previous session, is that we think that sort of, particularly given these existing and continuing risks to earliest provision that you heard about before, particularly for disadvantaged groups, we think the budget as it's currently formulated appears to be rather short-termist. So even if we only care about the sort of economic productivity side of things, which we don't, but if we sort of take that as its premise, that that's what it's focusing on, you know, the focus on kind of short-term growth, short-term increased employment of parents of young children, at the potential expense of quality and access to early education, this is going to be counterproductive in the long term. Because if children end up in low quality early years provision, or if they can't access it, this is likely to have long-term impacts on their trajectory through education and their future outcomes, including employment and earnings. So we think that policy should be set up strategically for sort of long-term success on whatever terms they're choosing to make themselves on.
Yeah. I mean, applying Anna's doorstep test, I have to say, a lot of parents are saying this feels quite long term to them because it's not coming into force immediately, and the offers that they've heard about aren't available yet. So I think it's an interesting challenge there, but I recognise the point. Thank you. I'll go over to Ian and then come down.
Thank you. I think what I would say is that we need to look at this through the lens of access, availability and affordability for parents, and what we fundamentally have here is a supply side issue. We have over-regulated the market. We've driven over half of childminders out of the profession over the last decade, and this has driven up costs, and it's driven out access, particularly for parents who work, atypical hours. In that light, I think the budget announcement is quite similar to Help to Buy, is perhaps the best analogy. It's an expensive demand-side subsidy which will cost a lot, will ameliorate some of the symptoms, it will help some families, but it does nothing to actually address the real underlying supply-side issues in the market. I think the regulatory reforms which are proposed, they're a good first step. I'm slightly alarmed that we haven't seen any detailed papers on them. As the Chair will know, DfE published a consultation on very similar measures last June, I believe, and nothing has come out of that. And it seems it's easier to make spending commitments than it is to actually address regulatory reform. That being said, if we can bring forward those on childminders and ratios, it would be a good first step. However, I would say we need to go much, much further in looking at the burden of the EYFS in particular, and at all the burdens which the state is putting in the place of parents being able to leave their children with who they wish, other than the safeguarding principles, which of course should not be compromised and obviously apply to other settings such as scouts, guides, tutors and so forth. We should really look at just allowing those who wish to get into the market to offer childcare to do so, and to allow parents to be the judge of where they would put their children. And this will have tremendous benefits, both for the availability of children, and we've heard that it's often those from disadvantaged families who have least access to childcare, and in terms of getting people back into the labour force.
Okay, thank you, Adam.
So I think firstly just to say that we were delighted that childcare had such a big place in a fiscal statement. I mean, there are lots of problems with and issues to be addressed in what was announced, but the fact that struggling families, that the costs of parents, that the lack of provision was at the centrepiece of that statement at a very difficult fiscal moment, I think is a real positive and is a testament to a lot of the people that have given evidence to this committee and members of Parliament that have championed it. The unusual thing, particularly for the Treasury, seems to be that they've gone big with the financing and the funding, the kind of harder bit, arguably, certainly politically, without doing some of the easier stuff. Not easy, but comparatively, some of the stuff that could be done on the provider side, I think is quite straightforward, is quite concrete and quite clear. And so that's where I think the biggest focus is now required. I agree with a lot of the comments that have come previously. We need to improve the skill levels and the professional development in the workforce. We need to unlock the potentials of intermediaries like childminder agencies to make some aspects of the market work. And I agree we need to streamline regulation as part of a balanced set of reforms. I'd agree with the comments on the EYFS. I think there are two other things we need to do, though, on top of that broad focus on quality and on skills. One, some ambition from all parties on a more radical overhaul of the system. Mr. Mearns raised a very valid question about whether we want to move to 8, 9, whether we want to move to a more simplified system. On would have made clear that moving towards a system of childcare credits, a simplified upfront system paid monthly that removes a range of these different entitlements would be the way to go, and to Ian's point would support a more dynamic market as a form of subsidy. But the second, to the questions that Mrs. Cates was raising earlier, is around increasing choice for those parents that do want to stay at home. And we have 3 ideas in our paper around front-loading child benefit, around a new approach to parental leave, and around the expansion of family hubs. So I can chat about all of those in more detail, but there are some real practical things the government can do that ensures that they're getting the most out of the investment that they've announced.
Yeah, and I think we will come back to some of that. I think in particular part of the challenge is from a DfE perspective. Some of that policy obviously falls outside of the DfE remit, but I think it is part of the challenge of looking at this as a whole. I guess we heard the debate earlier as well about the balance between child development, educational outcomes and workforce outcomes. Do you have a view as individually or collectively as to if the approach in the budget, which we heard was very heavily focused on the workforce outcomes of this, Is that missing the point? Is that right but only in part? And how do we balance those? I mean, I've always taken the view in arguing for investment in this space that actually they need not necessarily be opposed to one another. They can be complementary. But I think it is how do we make sure we're striking the right balance between those three?
So I mean, I agree with you that they don't need to be in conflict, because if we properly fund the system, if we have a good workforce, if it's an attractive profession to work in, if we have, as was mentioned before, sort of childcare providers, early education providers that parents actually want to have their children in, and as people said before, if the counterfactual of going there for some time enhances the child's life, then the parent can go to work and the child can have a great experience, and this is all going to go in the same direction. The problem right now is that the indications are, well, we already know the sector's underfunded, we already know that we've got the workforce crisis and so on. The really fundamental thing I think that we need is proper, as I said before, sort of properly costed, adequate. When I say adequate, I mean to get that level of quality, to get somewhere that parents want their children to go. We need that funding. Fundamentally, that's the first thing, and then everything can work in harmony. And it is more than it says in the budget. It is more money, but I don't think this is something we should apologise for advocating for. It's somewhere that's worth spending money.
I very much agree with you, Chair, that these don't have to be in conflict at all. They can very much work in tandem. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to bring out, is that there's a lot of focus which is rightly placed on the quality of the actual childcare settings, but we don't look enough at the cost to children of those not being available in the first place. And in a sense, what we've done by driving out flexible options, by driving out childminders, it's similar to what you see in very highly regulated labour markets. You see there that if you have a very highly regulated labour market, you will have some who happen to have get the prime contracts which are regulated, who have very good conditions. You'll have many others who are on short-term casualised contracts who have no rights at all. By insisting on high numbers of regulations, very tight ratios, very disproportionate ratios compared to the rest of the developed world, by imposing the EYFS, which since 2008 has driven out, I say, over half of childminders since then, almost half in the last decade. What we have done is we have significantly reduced the availability of any sort of childcare at all, which is particularly hitting those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And if they're not getting any childcare at all, that is actually worse than them getting what would be a perfectly good level of childcare which existed pre-2008 and which many parents were very, very happy with. Of course, we talk about minimum standards and so forth, but actually there's very little evidence, if you look at research from Canada, if you look at research in Australia, from the US, that many of the things that we have imposed on the system are doing anything to actually meaningfully drive up quality. And in some cases, such as ratios, they may actually be driving down quality because they prevent us from paying the workforce in the way that would attract the best people.
I would agree with much of what's been said. I think the way that you can square the circle is by emphasising and clearly prioritising parent choice. And so I can understand why in a fiscal statement in which one of the big challenges was labour supply, you'd focus on the labour participation side of the coin. We also have huge challenges in this country with family breakdown, with the psychosocial development of young people. And so I'd understand why in a future kind of fiscal statement or announcement, it may well be that there are other elements that I mentioned, kind of child benefit, parental leave, that might support a different cohort of parents. But there are clearly strong preferences by some parents that would like to spend more time at home and others that would like to go into work if they could, and we need sometimes different policies for both of those alongside broader reforms to a market.
Thank you. I'll bring in Kathy.
Thank you. I mean, ratios is an issue that the Petitions Committee has looked at because we had a very large petition signed in support of the Oliver Steeper family who very tragically lost their child at nursery and are very fierce campaigners for reducing the ratios further on the basis that it has been expressed by childcare providers that, and it was in the Department for Education's 2022 report on the early years workforce, that practitioners were concerned about the changes, possible changes to child ratios, viewing it as an unsuitable approach that could impact on the quality of childcare provision and increase workload and dissatisfaction among staff. I appreciate, Policy Exchange has a different view, and you've already expressed what you see as some of the potential advantages, but how do you deal with the viewpoint from childcare providers themselves that they see this as a backward step?
So I would say the onus is on them to provide an iota of evidence that the childcare systems in Australia, in Canada, in France, in Scotland, and in a host of other developed countries are somehow inadequate for this, which they fail to do.
I think the evidence is that the qualification requirements are very different in those countries, and that evidence is quite clear.
Qualifications can make a difference, that's certainly true, but they do vary quite widely between those countries. Ultimately, this is about parental choice. If parents want to put their children into it, to choose, a place which has a smaller number of ratios, they would be able to do so.
Do you honestly believe parents have a choice over all parents have a choice over where they put their children and what ratios there may be within that childcare setting?
Well, right now they certainly don't, because the places don't exist because we've regulated them out of existence.
Yeah.
So, if I may, I'm sceptical about the degree to which amending child staff ratios will impact on cost, have a positive impact on cost, and I think it might have a negative impact on quality. 3 quick things. So one, the point on the underqualification of the workforce. I think that can and should be addressed, so we can talk later about ways that you might upskill, but until you have, it seems odd to me that you'd relax the ratios and then do the upskilling work as opposed to sequencing things the other way around. Secondly, I agree with the comments made by the IFS previously that there's little evidence that the binding constraint for 2-year-olds is ratios, and actually there is a binding constraint of space. And so I think many formal childcare settings that wanted to take advantage of ratios would have to increase their premises. I think very few are in the financial position to do so. But the third thing is parents. I think, Ian's right that parental choice is a big element of this. We polled 10 policies with parents when we did our report. There was only one of those that had net opposition, and that was a relaxing of childcare ratios, even when we included in the question in line with other countries. 52% of parents opposed, 27% in favour. And that makes sense. When you talk to parents when they tour formal childcare settings, they very rarely say, the main thing that I'd like here is less supervision and more kids, right? And when we polled, actually the very top thing that parents wanted was staff being trained to a higher standard. That was 59% of parents. And that was above costs being low, which was 39%, and hours being flexible, 35%. So actually what parents want is highly trained members of staff. If we get there, maybe we relax ratios, but I don't think it's the top policy priority.
Amy, do you want to come on?
Just on this point about the sort of them being regulated out of loosening ratios, actually in the current framework there is a line that says you can actually not adhere to these ratios if you can show that it's not detrimental. And there is some evidence from the DFE's stats and surveys on this that actually some providers do already do this. But from the same research from the DFE, the indications are that most providers in line with this don't want to do it because they care about the quality of what they're providing and they know that it's not attractive to parents. What's also really worrying, though, actually on the sort of flip side of that, in the DFE's survey on this accompanying all of this going on, is that I think it was 28% of providers said they would change provision in response to ratios. Most of them said they would reduce staffing. Most said they would not pass savings to parents, and most said that they would implement these changes to support financial sustainability. So they're kind of being forced into this situation as a kind of like last resort option that's not going to improve things for anyone. And the danger, as was sort of talked about in the previous session of the committee, is that we develop this two-tier system because, parents are not actively going to choose. They're not going to go somewhere and go, I want the place with fewer staff. It's going to be the people who don't have other choices who go to the places with fewer staff. We see that throughout the education system, that the people who can make choices, who can afford to make choices do, those who are constrained don't. And that will be the outcome, that it will push towards kind of more diversity of quality.
Ian wanted to come in quickly on this one.
Just quickly as well, I think I've listened to quite a number of elements of evidence given to us that there's a great deal of concern amongst the workforce themselves about increasing child ratios. Because the bottom line is one day each individual member of staff is responsible for 4 children, and then the next day they may be responsible for 25% more. Okay, it's only one more child, but it's a lot over a day, over a week, over a month. You know, it's an awful lot of additional responsibility and an awful lot of additional activity for many staff who are already feeling the strain, frankly.
Yeah, and I think sort of something that hasn't been discussed enough in the context of the ratios debate actually is how this interacts with the issues with staff turnover in England. So this is one of the reasons that the international comparisons are not particularly useful, because we have this sort of crisis in terms of recruitment, retention, staff turnover. So in EPI research by our previous early years lead, Sara Bonetti, you found, I think it was nearly 40% of staff in early years providers leave within 2 years. And that means that you have, so if we change ratios, it's in a context where we have a turnover of staff. So maybe if you're in a country where you've got sort of a very stable, qualified staff, they know the children really well, the children know them really well, they're consistently there every day. Maybe you can tweak the ratios a bit. But in the context where there's so much else going on that's weak within the system, weakening another part doesn't make sense.
Very quick right of reply for Ian.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, you said we're looking after 25% more children. That also means you're getting 25% more funding. And that funding, yes, some of it could go to parents, but some of it could also be reinvested in the nursery, in quality and qualified staff.
Just in terms of the proposals, we heard some scepticism from the previous panel around the proposals for childminders in the budget proposal. I know both Ian and Adam, you talked about the importance of that market. Do you have a view on how the government's proposals in the budget will help to allow childminders to meet the demand that we expect to see from 30 hours policy, but also around the role of agencies, and perhaps invite you to explain, if you do disagree, why you do disagree with the comments we heard earlier about the role of agencies?
Yeah, so I think the things on childminders are positive if they do appear, and a good first step. They could go further. Fundamentally, I'll address the thing of agencies first. So the idea of agencies is that because we have placed so much regulatory burden upon childminders, that agencies can act as an intermediary. They can act as as essentially a broker who can handle much of that, can support childminders. There would obviously be a competitive marketplace. Those who weren't effective at supporting childminders would find it hard to recruit other childminders. Those who were successful would move forward. It feels that if we are going to insist on a system where we have this level of regulation, then childminder agencies can be very helpful in that role in terms of bridging the gap. I would say we can go further in terms of just simply reducing the regulation full stop, and is something which we should look at. There isn't enough in the government's proposal on the EYFS, for example, and that is somewhere where there could be significantly more. More positively, I think some of the more technical rules about whether childminders' own children count against the ratios are very positive. I think this will help with flexibility. I think there's a lot of little bits of detail in there which will not make, they're not transformative, but they're good things to do, and the government should be commended for them. I'd like to just pull out 2 further things. One, I do agree with the previous speaker who indicated they thought £600 probably wasn't enough to make a difference. It may help some at the margins, but I think we need to look more at improving the basic conditions of work, which means reducing that regulation, increasing access and availability rather than sort of a one-off payment to that. I wouldn't say no to it, but it's probably not the best use of money. And then the third one is there was a proposal that we made in our recent paper, which was allowing childminders to work outside the family home. This was done in France, and they've already had, in the 4 years since it was introduced, they've had 4,000 childminders move into this space, and more indicating they have interest. What this means is that people who want to be childminders, but perhaps their own home isn't suitable for it, could work in other premises. That could be church halls, that could be schools who want to use them to provide wraparound care. Again, it's just increasing the availability and putting more options for parental choice, and that's something which we think could have significant impact there.
Thank you. Adam.
I'm very supportive of the role that childminders can play. They offer this kind of high quality, flexible provision. The really unusual thing is the hierarchy in the mind of parents seems to be private nurseries are much much more preferable to childminders. About 46% of parents said that if money was no object, they'd use a private nursery, about 22% a childminder. But weirdly, childminders are the more expensive of the two options, right? The market hasn't responded to those signals. Childminder about 83 quid a week compared to about 76 for a day nursery. So I do think there's a big role here in increasing supply. I think childminder agencies have a major role to play. I was very pleased that there was that difference in the bonus, 1,200 versus 600. I'm similarly sceptical that that will persuade someone to change career or start a new career, but it's a step in the right direction. But I think we need to change some of the regulations around CMA. So a few things. One, there's this imbalance in the system currently whereby Ofsted get £1,000 per registered childminder, but a similar bonus doesn't go to a CMAs. That puts them in this weird competitive position with both their regulator, Ofsted in regulating CMAs, and regulators for the broader industry. So there needs to be recommended in our paper a £700 or £1,000 bonus that goes to CMAs for everyone they sign up, the same as Ofsted would get, and that might even help to lower some of the registration costs they see. Secondly, we do need to reduce some of the regulatory burden on childminders, things like GP checks that I think are unnecessary. And thirdly, we need to do something about landlords and how they interact with childminders. So evidence seems to be from providers and childminder agencies, a significant number of childminders going out to business is due to landlords changing the terms of that licence. And often these landlords are local authorities. So you have local authorities that with one arm of their organisation are very frustrated at the lack of childcare provision, and with another arm that I doubt is talking to the other part of the organisation are shutting them down. So a bit more joined up thinking to ensure that landlords are positive.
I've spoken to Duluth ministers about that particular issue, particularly with registered social landlords. It does seem extraordinary that so many of them ban people from doing childminding when it is clearly a social benefit to have it there. So that strikes me as something that does need fixing. But no, that's an interesting one. Sorry, Tammy, do you want to come in on this as well, on the role of childminders, and perhaps also you might have a different view about the EYFS.
So I can talk more about the EYFS side of things. In terms of the payment, I agree it doesn't seem very much. In terms of the childminder agencies, I agree with Eva on the previous panel that it's not very transparent what's going on and the evidence on them and sort of why this would be beneficial. So I'd like to know more about that so we can consider it. In terms of the EYFS, so the key reason, one of the key reasons that it was developed and put in place was to ensure that all children receive sort of consistent education and care and attention to their development, regardless of the type of setting that they attend. So that we don't think that differentiating the framework according to setting type is a good idea, because it could risk a lessening of knowledge of what to expect and ways to support children among settings not using the framework or using a different framework. However, saying that, we do acknowledge the points about the sort of burden of bureaucracy and paperwork and so on. And actually that applies not only to childminders, it applies to other types of settings as well. And I note that in the 2021 framework, it does explicitly state in more than one place that excessive bureaucratic documentation and recording of children's progress is not required. And I think this is in response to concerns raised about too much paperwork and bureaucracy. And obviously this links to later education as well. There's all sorts of issues around sort of accountability and paperwork and the workload issues with that for teachers. So we think that there is some scope for revision here in terms of kind of making the framework work in a way that is actually helpful for children and for people working with children, and easing some bureaucratic burden. We think it'd be worth clarifying how exactly the framework applies to the pre-reception years as opposed to the reception years, because most of the bits on bureaucracy seem to be kind of more applicable to reception baseline and foundation stage profile assessments, and it's not really clear what the implications are if they intend to lessen the burden for people working in the early years. So we think that that could be improved. As I said, we need to make sure that there's not sort of excessive bureaucratic paperwork and documentation that takes away from work with children rather than facilitating it. And we need to make sure that it's not seen as necessary by practitioners if it's not necessary, or required by regulators, including Ofsted, and that it's not perceived as being required by Ofsted that you have a ream of paperwork to show them.
Ofsted will often say that there's a lot of perception around what records need to be kept, which isn't always the case, and it is one of the constant challenges I know across the piece, is trying to myth bust sometimes on some of the records that do need to be kept versus those that actually don't.
Yeah, but then the question is sort of like, you might have that said at the sort of high policy level, but what's actually happening in practice when people are going into settings? Is it just that settings have a misconception, or in practice are they still being expected to show a lot? So there's something to be done there, definitely.
Thank you. I will bring in Miriam.
Thank you. The Treasury seems to be very confused about what they actually want from this policy, because on the one hand, most of the narrative around the budget was about increasing parents' participation in the workforce, particularly mothers, and yet even their own figures suggest that only around 60,000 parents may return to work in some capacity as a result of the changes. But when I asked a written parliamentary question to the Treasury about whether they've considered a more flexible use of the money, so to support people who want to stay at home, to support people using their vouchers to pay informal childcare, to make it more flexible, the reply was, no, we can't do that because we want quality education for children, which seemed a completely mixed message, because if you want quality education for children, that's an entirely different aim to trying to get mothers back into the workplace. They may be mutually achievable, but it's a different aim. So what do you see? What is quality early years education? Because other countries start formal education much later and yet have better outcomes. So what do you think these outcomes are that the Treasury is looking for from quality early education?
I mean, I presume they're looking at the sort of productivity side of things. And actually, you know, there are nuances, but the evidence is pretty clear that if you have good education, and this comes down to the workforce, it comes down to the detail of things. It's the interactions with children, it's the attachment, it's the attention, it's the ability of staff, you know, to pick up special educational needs and disabilities and to help children and to work with families. That if you have all of these things, then yes, it could be good for your well-being, it can set you up well for school, and that carries through. And I presume that's kind of the basis of what they are thinking about, but I agree with you that things are not very coherent at the moment, and I think this this comes back to what Christina said before about we've got these different policy areas kind of working around and in interaction with each other, but we don't have a sort of proper strategy or proper premises in terms of what we're trying to achieve, and we need to be a lot clearer. And I think it comes back to the question before about, do these things need to be in conflict?
Yeah.
Does there need to be a conflict between the kind of economic productivity angle and the sort of child well-being, support for families, support for parents angle? And actually, no, there doesn't.
Yeah.
There is actually a fairly simple solution here of having a properly funded system that parents would choose to send their children to, and that they would be happy to do that, and they would take advantages of the positives of working, that some of them would choose to take advantages of the positives of working, and net that would work kind of quite well.
Yeah. Ian, you talked about the bureaucracy of early years childcare, and that one of the barriers to childminders is not actually necessarily the low wages, although I'm sure that is the case, but of the bureaucracy of having to fill in forms and register with Ofsted and all those kind of things. Do you think that bureaucracy adds to the quality of early years care and education? What can we do to increase the quality?
Yeah. So no, I don't. And I think there's a couple of things. I would disagree with my sort of co-witness here a little bit on a couple of things. So I think there's a lot of reference to properly funded childcare. I think we do need to get away from a system which is, you know, from a mindset which is only about the taxpayer putting in more money into formal settings, and I think that underlies the assumption that there is a limitless pot to subsidise childcare. Sort of underlies a lot of what's been said to this committee. Now, I'm not saying it's not worth investing in. It is. The other area I'd push back there against is against the Treasury, because they say their whole thing of we want quality childcare, against your suggestion of what are informal options. It's very much a state knows best. I don't believe that's true. I think parents know best, and if they choose that the child would be better in an informal setting with a grandparent, perhaps with another setting in a more informal setting, or in a state nursery, which is absolutely fine as well, or being looked after at home by the parents, that is actually ultimately their choice to make. And actually what we've seen through our over-focus on trying to achieve quality through regulation is we've created a crisis. We have 70,000 more places today if we hadn't driven all those childminders out of the system. Actually, if we were looking at more radical overhauls, moving to a system of much more flexibility, potentially vouchers, but in which parents could use those to pay in a much wider variety of settings without the state controlling basic safeguarding checks, of course, or indeed direct payments to parents, which we see more of in France and in Canada, so that you could choose to stay at home or to pay for childcare, alongside with a relaxation on the unnecessary regulation, would actually increase affordability, access and availability. And those three watchwords, they are not how, I'll be honest, they are not how the Department for Education thinks of it. They don't see it as a crisis that we've lost 70,000 places. As long as the quality, the perceived quality based on certain frameworks of the places that still exist is there, that's all that matters. But we don't think about the places that we've lost and the places in informal settings and with relatives that could be made available under a more flexible system.
Because you said earlier that the government has totally over-regulated this labour market, and one of our earlier witnesses said that if this policy is fully rolled out, 80% of the available childcare hours will be bought by the state. So essentially, the state will have nationalised the means of production. And the catastrophe that will then bring for the market is quite predictable.
Well, I think you then you do have a real concern of the state setting prices, and if the state sets the price too low, then availability could really fall dramatically here. I'm sorry to come back to the analogy of housing again, but housing and childcare, other than the recent energy crisis, which is hopefully a short-term thing, but housing and childcare are probably the two biggest areas where costs have risen much faster than inflation and that make a real impact on the household budgets of almost every family in the country. And by housing, I'm including both rental and mortgage costs. If you look at both those markets, what do they have in common? They have massive, extensive government regulation which has massively restricted supply, has driven up demand, and has not really made anywhere any commensurate increase in quality. And I think the solution is obvious. It's for the state to provide subsidies or support, yes, support in terms of vouchers, in terms of direct supply, or in terms of help with childcare, not against those, but to get out of regulating the supply, at least certainly not get out, it may be too strong a term, significantly step back from it and allow the market to provide the services that, in this case, the parents want.
Thank you. And Adam, from your point of view, what does quality early years education look like, or should we be talking about care rather than education?
So I think, to step back a little bit and then come to your question. So I think there's lots and lots of good evidence that the state and developed nations should be investing far more in children at the age of 0 to 2 in a variety of different ways. I'm pleased that MPs like Andrew Leadsom have been kind of banging the drum on that and making that case.
That's about development, it's about child development is the main issue, isn't it, really?
Yes, in a broad sense, right? And so that would be the development that they can get in a family and a home setting, and the kind of development there, as well as in a formal setting, as well as an interaction with others. I think in terms of what quality provision looks like, I think there is good evidence that between kind of 0 to 1, that there is an emphasis towards a home care setting, that there is a benefit to children being in the home, and that from 1 to 4, there's a benefit depending on the parent's choice in the particular instance. And I agree with the evidence given in the previous session that a lot of this depends on both the quality of care in a formal setting and the quality of care provided in a home. But some sort of mix and balance is right. I think the really important thing about what the Treasury's objective is here, and this gets lost, I think, sometimes in the communications that they put out either publicly or in the House, are that there are 3 cohorts that need to be affected by this policy. One, parents who want to work but can't, and I believe there's a significant number of those. Secondly, parents that are working but are really struggling because of the cost of childcare. And third, parents that aren't working and would rather not and would like support to work from home. I think both of those first 2 groups care an enormous amount about the quality of formal provision, whether that's feeling comfortable dropping their kid off in the morning or feeling confident making the decision to take up these subsidies. And I think that's why we need more provider-side reforms to increase that quality. And I was pleased that we saw the announcements we did. It's that third cohort, parents that actually would rather not put their child into a formal setting early. That's where we need some more policy.
What does quality childcare look like, particularly for under 3s? Because again, the previous panel said there's not an awful lot of evidence for what's good and bad for under 3s. I mean, is it every childcare worker has a GCSE? Is it a nice room that's heated? Is it that they're learning phonics from the age of 6 months? I mean, what does it actually, what's the research that says what is quality care and quality childcare from 0 to 3? Do we know?
So I think we do know on some of those aspects, and the academics give evidence in the previous session will know some of this better than me. We do have good evidence that graduates being present in these settings is a benefit. We do have evidence about what the public realm and the physical setting needs to be like. We do have good evidence about the level of qualification, how that relates to ratios. Have we had a proper conversation about how all of that comes together, and therefore, given the state is now investing, as the IFS said in the last session, about double the amount they were previously, are we really clear about what we want this to achieve? Possibly not, and that's one of the reasons I'm actually keen for Ofsted maybe to move away from the very significant role they have in childminder regulation, because actually by stepping back from some of the micromanagement, they can step into a conversation about quality. And actually one of the things I want to be cautious about is, yes, Ofsted and the state probably need to step back from micromanagement regulation, but I don't think they need to step back altogether. They need to lean in, particularly from a DFE perspective, need to lean in to the upskilling and the training side of things far more, and I hope we can talk about that in a moment.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll bring in Kim.
Thanks. We heard from the first panel this morning about the major disparities in the quality of care for children, from disadvantaged and diverse communities or who have a special educational need. So, Tammy, can you say what you think is necessary to address these inequalities in early education? And do you think that quality can be improved when so much profit is extracted from the sector and not invested in wages and training?
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to sort of what I said in the initial response to the budget, really. I do think that there's both from an economic point of view and from a sort of ideological point of view, to be honest, there is an onus to provide, to make sure that children in poverty, children with disabilities, children from other disadvantaged backgrounds, including children in care and so on, can access good quality early education. And I was going to come in on the quality question because we've still got fuzzy definitions here, but I think we do actually know quite a lot about what that is, but that's a separate question. But it comes back to sort of the recommendations that I made before. I think that given the market, we need to incentivise providers to take children who might need more resources. So we need a much more heavily weighted early years pupil premium. We need a much more heavily weighted disability access fund with less onerous demands to get it, because it doesn't really work right now. And I think this comes back to the question of whether the state should be funding this. And I think that we can't just leave it to the market. We do need to have the state ensure that there is a parity of provision across people groups and across areas, so that, I mean, at the moment, sort of Quorum's latest survey for this year found that sort of over 80% of local authorities said they didn't have sufficient provision for children with disabilities, and that's just shocking, that the budget is now looking at expanding things to subsidise more advantaged children of working parents, essentially. What did Christina say before? Sort of 80% of it is just going to be a subsidy. We've got more sort of pressing, crucial things going on here, more sort of massively unmet needs that I think we need to be looking at first. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
And how do you think that happens, given that we've got also a crisis in terms of workforce, the training and retention of staff within the sector currently, because, the pay and the value of the work that's undertaken is seen so negatively at this moment in time?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, at risk of sounding sort of repetitious, I think that the sector needs to be paid better. So as you know, sort of various stats, including us at EPI, show that sort of nearly half of the early years workforce claim in-work benefits due to low pay. And we've also got some research, again, by Sora Bonetti, our previous early years lead, which really showed the kind of thin edge of the wedge here. So 13% of the workforce earn less than £5 an hour. The average wage across the early years workforce is £7.42 an hour. And that compares to £12.57 for the total population. So it's not an attractive profession if you need money, which we do. We need, when we're working, we need to be paid adequately, and we want to attract people in and have it be an attractive profession. So again, it comes back to funding and not sort of putting the sector on the back foot by underfunding the funded hours. If you're going to roll out the extended 30 hours, then do it properly, so that the sector isn't at sort of a loss and having to cross-subsidise and so on. And again, this sort of relates to the sort of staff training and development as well. So making sure that sort of, and the ratios as well relates to this, making sure that there's enough time and money and staff so that staff can develop and train in role, because again, that makes it more attractive and it's good for children. And we think that it's also worth looking at introducing more parity with later education stages in terms of the structure of sort of different qualifications and routes within the early years workforce.
Things like the ECF and MPQs, which are available in other parts of education.
Yes, possibly. I mean, there's lots of ways to have career paths and progression, aren't there? And we definitely think that's worth looking at. And it's worth sort of looking back at sort of, you know, the past decades. So I think it was Eve on the previous panel mentioned the Graduate Leader Fund and how that worked. And it was embedded in this wider workforce strategy. And there were, again, it comes back to this kind of not having proper strategies, not having proper policies with a specific focus. And that had this specific focus. It had ring-fence funding. And it saw the qualification levels, not just more graduates, but more level 3s happened under that strategy. And then that finished. Then instead we had, this was asked about before, I think, we had the GCSE requirements come in instead. And they don't seem to have had a helpful effect. The workforce has de-skilled after they were introduced. So I think we need to look really carefully at sort of what qualifications or types of qualifications or content of qualifications is actually useful, what training and development is actually useful, not just box ticking, and what mix within settings is useful and what's useful for the leaders as opposed to the ground level staff. Sorry, I feel like I went on a bit of a tangent with that.
That's helpful. Can I bring in Andrew? And actually, just on this point of qualifications and the mix, we've heard a lot about the mix in that respect. What a lot of nursery leaders, practitioners will have said to me is that actually a qualification doesn't necessarily define how well someone will work with children. You can have people who are experienced in working with children who have no qualifications whatsoever, but who provide a really valuable contribution as long as they are part of that overall mix. How can you design a system to perhaps recognise that?
Yeah, I mean, sort of we think that the system should definitely recognise that. I don't think we don't have good kind of national quantitative evidence on what the optimal mix is right now, and that's kind of what we want for national policy making. So if we're doing things at that level, I think that one thing that we'd recommend is that firstly, we should sort of review systematically the evidence on this, and then we should maybe pilot and evaluate different sort of, because we don't know enough, we should actually do some experiments with this. Let's look at sort of what mixes work well for children in terms of the kind of the types of qualifications and and experience as a separate thing of staff. And that would include, you know, oh, sorry, am I overrunning? Shall I let
I can let the others quickly come in on that and then go to Andrew, sorry. Adam.
I think it's really important to focus on flows as well as stocks. So I am nervous and worried about the level of qualifications there are in the workforce. I'm particularly nervous about the number of people that are participating in training while they're in work. Right? So we've seen that the proportion of people studying towards a higher qualification fell by about a third between 2008 and 2018, about 23% to 15%. 17% of the early years workforce are receiving job-related training. So I think the real thing we need to focus on, instead of how many at the point they are trying to access the profession have a qualification, is how can we maximise the number that are working towards some kind of formal qualification or are participating in professional development. If I could just pepper 5 things that I think you guys should be thinking about in terms of policies. 1, getting more graduates into the workforce via a kind of Teach First style scheme. Canada spent about $420 million on grants and bursaries for students that are studying. So think about how we can incentivise graduates. You might create a specific pathway. Secondly, centralising continuing professional development into a single portal, so not getting rid of diversity of different types of training or supplies of training, make it much easier for an individual learner to access. Thirdly, extending the early career framework to early years. I think it's worked very well in teaching and should be moved across. 4, increasing opportunities to retrain. So when the lifelong loan entitlement is created as part of the lifetime skills guarantee, you should be really pushing people to study towards that level 3 diploma for the early years workforce, whether that's by a public information campaign or using intermediaries like trade bodies. And 5th, apprenticeships. So SMEs really struggle to access the apprenticeship system. Part of that is making the system easier, but it's also, so the London Progression Collaboration are a really good example in London who have sought to overcome some of those frictions in nurseries or daycare centres, taking on apprentices. So using, I think, all 5 of those tools could help improve the flow of skilled staff.
And while that sounds great, while we've had evidence from childcare providers freeing up staff to be able to access training is a major challenge. But I just want to ask one final question, whether you believe that the childcare announcements in the spring budget actually do what it's supposed to do, or simply papering over the cracks because there hasn't been strategic enough to make the changes necessary to provide a high quality early years provision for all of those that need it. Anyone?
It's a fantastic first step. There is much more to do.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to address the issue of qualifications, so I will let my colleagues go first on that question.
So I mean, I think that sort of, as has been alluded to throughout sort of the previous sessions, it's just kind of throwing another thing into the mix, and we think there does need to be sort of more focused strategy with clear objectives so that we can actually make policies that have a good chance of meeting these objectives. So our sort of key recommendations really quickly are that we need to weight funding much more heavily towards children from low-income families and children with disabilities. We need to ensure all the funded hours are properly funded. Don't weaken ratios, fill the void in the early years workforce strategy and encompass that. And also, we haven't touched on in this session, but the previous session did, we think that the re-expansion of the local children's centre model should continue, because that's a very important part of things.
I mean, I think to be fair though, the money which has been announced in the budget wouldn't touch the sides with that shopping list.
No, I mean, and I was happy to say we need more money.
Yeah, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, and I would just say on the announcement, it's a first step. It's weighted too much towards the demand subsidy rather than supply side, but it will help some people. But fundamentally, we need to put access, affordability, and availability at the heart of this, and that means supply side. Just on qualifications, if I may, I would draw a distinction between having good development routes for staff, which they can use to progress and improve their skills, which I would very much support. And I think many of the things which my colleague was saying are very sensible there, and having barriers which prevent people with the skills needed to working in there. So I'm not a fan of the GCSE maths requirement that was alluded to in the previous session. When I was in the Department for Education, I was very pleased that we removed the GCSE maths and English requirements for T levels. I've also been campaigning to have them removed from apprenticeships. I don't believe that just because someone's not academic, we should bar them from using their skills, which may be very considerable in other settings. And many of the best people who would be brilliant at working with 2, 3 and 4-year-olds may not have the academic skills to have passed GCSE maths or English. Ditto with degrees. Fantastic to have routes to encourage graduates in, or to encourage people who wish to work towards that, but I wouldn't want it to see it become a graduate-only profession. Where I think that two areas which could more be done, I'd echo the call on apprenticeships. This is something where support for SMEs, support for, but even something supported at the childcare profession in particular, could be very, very helpful. We could also look at T-levels. T-levels would be a great route for taking 16 to 18-year-olds. Again, you would probably need some support for childcare providers to provide the placements. The 9-week placement is a big issue to take someone on, but actually it's a great way of getting someone in who may then be able to join the workforce immediately after completion of that T-level. And it would be a great way to get talented people in.
On that very point, I was going to bring in Andrew, but Mayfield, your question's already been answered.
Well, I mean, yes, the disadvantage of being a late questioner is that your sort of fabric of questions has got lots of holes shot through it already. So I just wanted to see if anyone has anything they'd like to add about government action or government getting out of the way. But either way, what should government's focus be in terms of developing the childcare workforce, in terms of what we've heard in this session and the previous one about the huge shortages and shortfalls that we've got within it? And I'll start with you, Adam, and go along.
In terms of things to add, and this I think relates to the workforce issue, I think one of the challenges that has been alluded to is the narrowness of some of the subsidies that exist currently and the complexity to parents. So although lots of parents are aware of some of these schemes, particularly on tax-free childcare, very few people take it up, about 1 in 4 that are eligible. So that's why I really do think that probably not for now, but certainly for the beginning of a new parliament, any government should be looking at moving towards a much more simplified system. So we've said a single childcare credit that brought together the universal elements in one childcare credit and then the means-tested elements into an advanced childcare credit, paid in advance in the form of a voucher that can be used on both formal provision but also things like after-school clubs, would both, and that was paid directly to providers as opposed to going through local authorities or any sort of government system like the tax-free childcare, would massively remove some of the supply-side barriers, would increase parental choice, would decrease administrative burdens on the payment systems around some of those providers too. So that sort of ambitious system that would require departments that I know don't always like working together to work together quite closely. I think that is what the next priority needs to be.
Right, thank you.
Nothing to add at this particular point, thanks. I think I've covered it all.
Ian?
I don't think anything to add from me either.
I will just add that we have several times talked about what we need as someone who's providing childcare or early years education, as if it's one sort of specific set of qualifications for everybody in a sector that obviously needs a hugely diverse range of skills and abilities within the sector. So I wonder, we perhaps reflect this in what we're going to say, but this, you need to be a graduate, you need to have GCSE, or you don't, or you do, or childminders are different than more formal settings. I just probably need to explore at some point. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Ian?
Yeah, I'm just wanting to sort of look at, I mean, sort of given my accent, you might guess I come from one of the provinces of England, right? So what could the government do to ensure that the new expansion to childcare subsidies also address inequalities in access to quality education, early years education, especially across different regions?
So one thing I would say is that I think some of this question shouldn't be addressed through the free childcare offer. I'd echo what others have said about the need to ensure that we're working with young children through other means, through family hubs, through direct support for families. I don't think we should be assuming that all of the sort of support in terms of access to high quality education should be run through the childcare system. It just will have a lot of people who will fall through the cracks that way. And we've talked about how, there's a high deadweight cost in a lot of those subsidies. If you try and do it that way, end up accruing to well-off families. What I do think is most important, and I'm going to come back to this, availability as distinct from affordability here. And one of the things which we've really seen has been a problem with the fall-off on childminders in the as part of the system is irregular hours childcare or flexible childcare. So if you work shifts, for example, then you can't say, well, I want childcare every Tuesday, because you might not be working every Tuesday, and you can't say every Thursday because you might not be working every Thursday. And actually, you will have childcare settings who will turn away people like that because they say, well, because of my ratios, I can't have that. I've got to have someone who's every week, because otherwise some weeks I'm going to be only having 3 people instead of 4, and I can't afford that because I can't afford to make my staff. You also had childminders traditionally would offer a lot more things, out of hours. You want to just someone who will look after 2 children going on to 10 in the evening because their mum's a nurse or their mum's working the late shift at Tesco and they need that setting.
But that seems to run counter to the overall labour market demand for much more flexible employees in terms of when they're available, and having people who can sort of do everything in a drop of a hat and then come in and do 4 hours and then go home and then come back and do 6 hours later, Yeah.
Well, traditionally this was the role which was filled by childminders who would take a smaller number of children than nurseries, and the fact that they have gone out of the settings because we've demanded the same from that sort of casual provider of childcare, who was still doing a great service to the parents, who was looking after the kids, who was probably teaching them stuff, providing them emotional support.
They never do it at no notice. That's the trouble. And unfortunately, that's what many employers are looking for. They're looking for no notice flexibility from their staff.
And they're not going to, those sort of providers aren't going to go in the system where they've got to comply with the same level of regulation paperwork that, you know, a Busy Bee nursery, which is a massive company with huge numbers of people to take care of the paperwork, have got to do. If we want to get that access to the disadvantaged people, to people working shifts, we've got to accept that, you know, there's greater flexibility in what.
I mean, I'm much more interested from the perspective of this question is, you know, there are parts of the country which are relatively prosperous, but with small islands of deprivation. And there are other parts of the country which are largely deprived, but with small pockets of prosperity. So how do you compensate for that around the country? Tammy, and then I'll bring
yeah, so sort of going back to that question, actually I agree with the point about children's centres, about investing in that Sure Start model and sort of rejuvenating it, because actually it's interesting because in research that I did at LSE with colleagues there, we looked at sort of local area variation in where people were able to access preschool. And what we found was that in areas where there was more Sure Start provision, more children went on to go to preschool. And we think this is because sort of in the detail in terms of what's happening on the ground, because it's a kind of community hub orientated holistic service, it kind of built that trust, it kind of joined up with other things, and then children then accessed more sort of preschool, more childcare. So actually I agree with that as one of the kind of solutions to the local area disparities.
I think this is one of the areas where there's a real role for market intermediaries. So to say what I mean by this, there are going to be different labour markets that require different shift patterns and different types of workers. And often if you're a big company, whether you're in logistics, distribution, whatever, you need a lot of people to do shift work. You work through an agency, right? You'll say, and that's because they solve collective action problems. You say, I need a bunch of workers for these times, and they help you do that. Now, why don't we apply a similar thing on childcare? So that's where childminder agencies can play a role. They can get a difficult brief about the type of workers that are needed in an area, what times they might need to be available, what premises they might need, what location they might need to be in, and they can help solve that collective action problem. I get very nervous about the state doing that, or even local government doing that, because they often can't be nimble or agile enough. So this is where I think there is a role for CMAs in addressing some of these gaps and helping parents to get more flexible care.
Maybe you should look at what's been happening with the supply teacher market recently, but that's another matter.
Okay, I think we've comprehensively overrun our time, thanks to the high quality of the evidence we've had from both panels. So thank you. There's one last question I just wanted to ask, which is, I guess, one of, for me, the missing elements in the budget announcement. And perhaps a kind of one-word answer from the panel would be great. But we've heard in this inquiry about many of the problems with the tax-free childcare offer, and the fact that something which is good on paper isn't really working for parents, low take-up, complexity of use, etc. Do you believe that the tax-free childcare system needs to be rethought? I think Adam's already basically said yes.
Yes.
I mean?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.